Any questions?
Yeah. Whilst you were talking, for most of the time, I thought that ICT stood for Independent Control Technology.
Oh, sorry.
I've now been told that it doesn't.
Yeah, sorry.
And I've been told what it does stand for. But in relation, and I talk as an elderly person who doesn't yet talk to plants,
Right.
somewhere in between.
It would be the plant that talks to you first, so it wouldn't
Oh,
be
it's
quite
quite good to know. Thank you for that. Anyway, in relation to smart homes,
Yes.
are you suggesting that you really need remote control rather than a control panel in the home to make them work? Is really what my question's about.
Yeah, well, I would say I'm personally not suggesting anything in that respect.
Well, you've done a research on 20
What's being
homes.
suggested in the industry material is, very much remote control is what people are going to want. They're going to want, they would argue, to be able to access our homes wherever we are. We want to be able to close the curtain when we're on the beach in Jamaica. That's how they're being sold. You can access your home 24/7 wherever you are in the world, and you can make it do things without you needing to be there. Which people would argue, some people say it's great for security. Some people would say it's great for energy management. You can make sure your heating's not left on. You don't have to worry about whether you left
I
the
think
iron
I
on.
was probably thinking in terms of energy management
Yeah.
and that sort
But
of
so
thing.
that's how it's being sold. It's very much a kind of. We have in the content analysis, we looked at actually what is the nature of the interface, and there's a kind of even split. Well, actually, generally it's more than one interface, not just one. Generally speaking, there are some fixed interfaces in the home, might be on the wall, a control panel, just as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But almost always, there's also some kind of online interface that you can access through an app on your phone or your iPad, or just generally on any kind of internet-enabled computer you can get to. So there's multiple different ways in which you can interface with these sorts of things. But then the kind of point that I emphasised today was the only way in which you can interface then, like multiple portals, as it were, but you can only really talk to it through the specific software that they've made available.
Okay, thank you for that.
Dale had one.
I thought that was really good, thank you. And I suppose, I'm not sure if this is a question or a point of clarification,
Right.
but I got a little bit confused in a way towards the end about what to do with the vignettes and stuff. So I suppose my general point would be that the three blobs and then the more blobs,
Yeah, lots of blobs.
the lots of blobs, provide you with a very micro detail sort of level of analysis, and I don't know what if we're going to try and explain the world through that very micro detail, where that gets us. But my confusion, I guess, is that ICTs, which in this case are all mobile phones and that kind of stuff, how much or how closely related they are in terms of the types of technologies that were at the beginning of the talk, which were essentially technologies which are automated and about the energy consumption in the home, and how much you can draw across horizontally to make an analysis, because I think that the kind of ICTs you're talking about are very, very different from the kinds of technologies that are going to be in the smart house, or at least they're being seen about it as being put in the smart house. And then that makes me wonder about the whole practices bit anyway, so from the vignettes. So here's a case anecdote from 20 years ago, which is that my typical evening at my house when I was about, I say, 10 or 11 and my sister about 13 or 14, is that my mum would read the newspaper, I would play with Lego or something like that, maybe a bit younger, so I'd be really cool then. My sister would do some drawing or something like that, and my dad would do the crossword whilst the TV was on. That's not very different from what your vignette said. The only difference is that we were using paper and plastic bricks, and they're using those kinds of technologies. And so in a sense, where's the change in the practice other than the incorporation of the technology? And that then makes me wonder, is it the entry point to the analysis? Should it be the technology itself, or should it be the practices in which those technologies are being appropriated? And that gives you then a different framing and a different analysis. But in terms of the kinds of technologies at the beginning, and I completely agree with your analysis. So the problem is with them that they assume a rigid temporal pattern, and actually there's quite a lot of technologies for managing heating flow, and most of the sort of social science evidence shows that the real problem with them is that they are just too automated.
Yeah, thank you to respond, I guess, I mean, the micro point, I would contend that these kind of models of practice allow you to look both at the micro and at much larger systemic interrelationships between practice. I mean, that I can only emphasise one interconnected practice in my actual picture, but just imagine that blown up infinite, you know. So I don't.
That's my problem, is I struggle to imagine it blown up.
Yeah. Okay. But so I don't think there's any necessary limit there. I think larger scale systems are made ultimately and remade through practices that are integrated together. So I don't necessarily agree with you on that point. The ICT smart versus smart, the ICT technologies I focus on at the end, the same. Absolutely and completely agree. I mean, that's the point that I kind of was trying to make, and that's what we've got at the moment. What are people using in their homes? How are they using ICTs? And we're just doing the kind of smart homes. How are they using the smart home kit that we're installing? We've not got data on that yet. Right. And one of the questions I'm kind of trying to ask myself is how comparable are they? I mean, one argument here is then, if you take your point, is that smart home kits are indeed a very different beast to anything we've got. So nothing is comparable, or can we find things that are comparable? We can find things that are labelled smart, but of course that's not necessarily any more representative or comparable than smart home technology. But that, I mean, I would agree with you. That's a question I'm quite interested in. I think one of the things I would perhaps emphasise, and I'm maybe getting there slowly, is the point I made on the very last slide about smart home both introduce new ICTs into practice, but they also try and coordinate schedule across. Perhaps the task for me is not to focus generally on ICT use, as I perhaps did on in the vignettes, but focus very specifically on ICT use as a means of remote control, scheduling, automation, and that kind of thing, which might be a better proxy for smart home. So maybe I need to be a little bit more informed and subtle in my comparison. But I take that point, it's one that I'm struggling with. And then your final point, yeah. And in a way that's the question I'm kind of trying to get at. I mean, there's a lot of talk about ICT going to radically change practices. But some of the things I'm trying to emphasise through those vignettes was, well, this seems to be changing some, or at least allowing potential changes to some, whilst it reinforces and stabilises and keeps others the same. So I'm kind of trying to get at that question of what's the change in the practice that ICT is kind of enabling or not. But you're probably right in that the focus should be on the practice rather the route in should be on the practice rather than the... So that might be yet another way of cutting this pie, rather than focusing on... again, just saying, well, let's pick a practice across our 20 homes, which is actually what we did try and do that originally, but it didn't work quite so well. But maybe that's something to return to. It's something that we're grappling with right now. But you might be right there. I mean, certainly, you know, if you take seriously the idea that practice theory makes practice the central unit of inquiry, then why don't you start with technology?
We've got one from Anna, one from Frank, and then one at the back.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering, in your sort of video tours and the initial research, did you look at, you must have looked at, you know, how people use thermostats and how they heat their homes. Do you have any sort of early findings on those sort of areas? Because, I mean, like, sure, thermostats would be sort of basic, smart.
Yeah, it came up, but we tried not to focus on it too much, very deliberately, because we were very caught. We had quite a fight within our consortium, should we say, between those who wanted to make this all about energy smart homes. Well, no, we can market this as a we can save you energy trial, by giving you smart heating controls. And others in the consortium who thought, well, no, actually, if we want to know about smart homes, it's not just about energy, as we saw in our analysis of market. That's a big theme, but one among many. And if you read and sort of Inge Rutger and Sophie Nyborg's work, their argument is actually, although energy might be present across all of them, the dominant narrative in many of them isn't energy. It's about fun, it's about leisure, it's about comfort and convenience. So in that respect, energy might be... So we intentionally didn't make that an explicit focus, although it did come up at times. But I can't, off the top of my head, sort of really say anything interesting about that you know, I can talk about specific examples, but probably want more than that.
In the interest of time, maybe we should move on to Frank.
Thanks, Tom. I really liked your talk. Very accomplished and very interesting. I had two similar questions that are quite similar to Dale's point. And maybe it's sort of a little bit of a worry that your own assumptions of how the world works or should work are sort of really coloring your conclusions. So one was where you summarized what social sciences have to say about technology and practices, and you made a very strong claim people want control over their technologies. And I'm not quite sure if that's really what you found, or if that's your own judgment of what they should want. Because many people, particularly the technologies that you mentioned and Dale mentioned, heating, and we don't really want to think about those. That's why they're so different from phones and smartphones that you really consciously engage in. For most people, heating or lighting, it's just a background. I mean, we take it for granted. We don't really want to think about the heating. When it breaks down, it's a real pain. So I'm not sure if people want control over those kind of, and if automation can take over some of these things, many people might say, well, that's fine. Yeah. So I did sometimes feel there's a very strong STS normative conviction that the industry is bad and automation is bad and people should be in charge, and the democratization of technology. So that's one point where I felt I'm not always sure if you are speaking or if this is what the evidence says. And the second was the same puzzle that Dale had, that I felt you're also very strongly wanting to show how complex and messy daily life is. But if you take practice theory, it actually says daily life is very routinized. It's very often the same. I felt this was your judgment, but my reading of practice theory is that it's actually got a very different starting point. And then also the way you told your vignette, you really emphasized the messiness and this and that, but I'm pretty sure you could tell the same vignette as you sometimes did. This guy goes to the pub the same days of the week, he does the same Sudoku puzzle. You could probably tell the same story, but a completely routinized, or the military position. So you could, again, I felt a little bit, well, you're emphasizing this, but that's always the problem with vignettes. And so there's a bit of a methodological puzzle. Practice theory does not really focus on individual people and how they live their lives. So I did feel you moved from everyday life, routinized reproduction of daily life, to how individual people live their daily life. So maybe sort of confusing the practice as an entity versus the performance of a practice. Yeah. And you kind of shift from practice theory to almost an ethnographic idea where daily life is an accomplishment. And of course you can then find the messiness and all that. I felt your method and your theory are not quite...
Yeah, no, I mean, on the first point, if I said people want control over their technology, then that was a slip on my part, so I apologise. I mean, actually, the quote that actually was in an earlier draft of the presentation was, rather than control over technologies, people want control over their lives. So it's a very different, so if I said that, then that's a very different kind of... So that's a slip on my part, so apologies. I mean, very much the social science literature is saying that a narrow focus on controlling technologies isn't actually the sorts of things that people, across a wide range of different qualitative studies of people's use of smart technologies, that doesn't seem to correspond well with what people do seem to want. They're not interested in ever finer controls, it seems, of their heating in their spare room. They want, that they can control from Jamaica, they want, actually some sense that the military precision with which they have to coordinate their busy everyday lives, how can you make that happen? So perhaps that's perhaps a slip on my part. The second one, I mean, I take that point, and I think, as I said, this is stuff I'm really struggling with at the moment. I'm trying to take I'm at this level of vignettes, so I'm not at the broader level of kind of looking systematically across the whole body of data that we've got. So it might well be that sort of both the point you and Dale make about kind of, actually is it the stability, are we seeing sameness and not much change at all here? And routinization, is that what's coming through here? So it might be that does come out, but I'm kind of not there yet in a way, so thanks for your advice on that one, I think. And then your point about the kind of performance entity, I think you're probably right that, well, and it's one of I think probably the challenges with the methods that we're using here is we are tending to emphasise the performance of practices by particular groups of practitioners in their homes, right? And then there is a big question about, well, how can you scale up from that? How can you make the leap from a practice's performance to a practice's entity? To what extent do you say that a change in one individual set of practitioners' performances in a particular practice does correspond to or have any impact on a broader practice entity? We're dealing with 20 homes here. So there are questions there which makes it very difficult to say, and I don't think we can probably make any kind of conclusions in our study of the nature that practice entities are changing in this way or that way, but we might hopefully be able to make conclusions of the sort that smart home technologies seem to be influencing the performance and engagement of practices in different kinds of ways. So probably you're right, I need to be more careful and subtle about how I'm employing the theory through that part of the talk. But in my defence, I just say it's stuff that I'm grappling right now, and I'm very pleased that you both picked up on that, because that's something I can kind of take away and actually work on much more carefully. Is it my normativity coming out? Probably. To be brutally honest.
One at the back there and another one.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I thought that was also very, very interesting and very provoking presentation. And for me, I'd like to go back to this question of control, which was raised earlier. And for me, that was potentially something that really warrants to think of further discussion, because also the question of control, particularly power, is one of the blind spots that has been traditionally in practice theory generally. And yet, coming into this whole context is very much potentially a new reconfiguration of relations of power in the home. Because the introduction of these technologies, you could argue, brings forth a new set of networks which were not there before. I mean, I don't think it's just quite a set of, the replacement of plastics and whatever with another set of plastics, because these plastics happen to be linked in to all sorts of new relations of property, power, extending across vast distances. And, so one question that I would ask is, in your experience, in your findings, are these individuals, are these subjects more or less empowered by the introduction of this new set of technologies? Power, not just power to control their own lives, which you mentioned before, but in terms of the overall set of economic, political relations that enter the home with them. And maybe that's something you could perhaps push a little bit further, in terms of your conclusions in the general discussion.
It is, and you just pushed it further still. The control focus is one that actually I've just put an abstract into the ECEEE for next year to focus very specifically on smart home control, and to really try and tackle the notion that Frank picked up on around control of technologies versus kind of the many other forms of control in the home that smart homes kind of bring to the fore, or kind of actually upset and disrupt. I mean, control over who does what at what time. I mean, we've not got anything from this study yet, but from some of my previous work on kind of in-home displays, I've got good examples, lots of data of particularly husbands who will use their understanding of when the kettle's been put on to understand how many cups of tea their kids and wife are having. And ones where homeowners will use that to see whether or not their kids are playing computer games in their bedroom rather than asleep, and that sort of thing. So there's lots of kind of interesting things around surveillance. There's one guy talking about he loved the in-home display because it finally gave him evidence that his wife left the lights on. And I'd love to live with this guy, wouldn't you? And so that is an area that we'd be getting to about control within the home. But then your kind of argument to extend that still further, I think, is really exciting, and one that we've not perhaps got to so far. And to what extent is this, you're kind of empowering? I mean, my argument, I've not thought about it firstly, so brilliant, more to think about. But one, if you look at certainly some of the marketing materials, what are they getting? They're not democratising technology. They're not allowed to get into the engage and design of these sorts of things, right? They're only allowed to take them off the shelf, and then they're only allowed to engage and tailor and customise the specific functions that whatever bit of smart home kit they bought allows them to. So in that respect, it's a very, very narrow form of empowerment in the first place. It's not anything broader than that, right? So I guess I'd say that as much as possible, they are trying to limit that empowerment to empowerment within the home rather than beyond that. And then, of course, empowerment within the home, as I've just brought out, leads to redistributions of relations of power within the home, right? So that kind of it's not a simple, some are empowered and some are disempowered by the same thing. But I've not gone further than that, and that's something, I was actually talking to Andy at lunch a bit about this in relation to debates around the smart cities and smart grids. But actually pushing the smart home focus further into that kind of thing would be really interesting. So thanks again. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's something more to think about. Hopefully it answers it in terms of what we have got, but there's a lot more to do, clearly.
Great, Tom. I know a question.
Hi, yeah, I mean, first I suppose to confirm this thing about power, I did my dissertation on heating controls.
Yeah.
And very much and I only did it on a small number of families, but once I started talking about it with other people, I found this thing about men trying to control their partners and their children was incredibly commonplace in terms of that's what they saw the heating controllers doing. They set the heating controls. But the second point I really wanted to make was another thing that I found in Europe was the way that actually the complexity of the technology and the difficulty of the technology acted on the people in the home as well. That they didn't understand how the thermostat worked, they didn't know how to change it, and this was partly used as a control mechanism by some people in the house, but it's also much broader than that. I remember talking to one woman who was talking about the temperature on this, and she knew that she was supposed to have the temperature at about 20 degrees, right, and the thermostat in the main hall, right. Meanwhile, she was freezing in another room where she actually worked. But she knew she shouldn't turn this up because it was at 20 degrees and she'd seen it on TV, but that's, it should be 20 or 19 degrees. And so there's something about the technology actually being an actor in this. It has its own self in a way that it acts on people in the house. And I suppose another part of that is, in the vignette about the iPad, actually I think your man needs an iPad not for any particular purpose, because he wants an iPad. It's because the technology is acting on him in the sense of this, it's something that men want, is new gadgets. If you just, a lot of the men I know have bought iPads, not for any particular reason, just because they want an iPad or a new phone or whatever. So I think the idea that they're doing it for rational purposes.
I mean, I guess
you're probably not saying that.
No, the point I was trying to make with Henry was that he kind of wanted to think that he was quite adamant that it would change something so others would kind of try to stabilise others. And so it's kind of.
But it's actually the wrong solution. I mean, there's a different solution, really. There's a better solution, isn't there?
Yeah, there probably are. But I guess the point, to the extent, and this is picking up on Daz, to the extent that the iPad vignette was comparable to the smart home, is the extent to which will smart home technology be taken up in relation to some practices but not others. And so it's presented as an all-purpose, this will change your home life across the board, but actually, if ICTs are more or less welcome, as it were, in some practices rather than others, then that becomes an interesting question about how they might have differentiated effects across everyday life, across different homes. I'm not sure I kind of picked up the question there.
One way of, you could look at come back to networks.
Yeah.
That kind of approach to it, where the actual objects themselves are players in this whole thing, acting on different people and constraining and changing the way that they operate.
Yeah, I'd say we're not there yet because we've not, at this point in time, actually looked at how we're using the smart home kit, we're looking at other technologies, so we've not gone into that level of depth. The one thing I would say that one thing that is coming out, although it is literally this is data that's being collected as I was on the train up here, sort of thing. The people who tend to use this thing, which is generally the man in the house, thinks of it as something that's to be used by everyone in the house. Everyone else in the house thinks of it as his little toy. We have had examples, particularly with one elderly couple, where he's been ill recently, and his wife, I've forgotten their names now, but his wife says, I dread to think what would happen if he wasn't here, because we'd be left with all this stuff that I have no idea how to use it. I wouldn't be able to use my own home. As a good example of kind of who's using this sort of stuff. And a good example as well, the point in the industry marketing about how little thought and attention has been given to how multiple users might actually engage with this stuff.
Thanks, Tom. I think there's time for two quick questions. So Ali had one and then...
It was sort of more of a kind of pragmatic question, really, just to get a sense of how you're kind of connecting with the industry around. I know you sort of touched upon the fact of only just getting to the data collection and doing the analysis, but I know from other projects you've done that sort of engagement aspect as being a big one, and I was just curious as to how you see that developing or how you develop that across the course of this Greenfield project.
Yeah, we've got 10 industrial partners on the project. So actually RWE Power, who I focused on their wildly optimistic visions of savings, are one of our kind of partners. And they're very, very, very interested in this, partly because it's a chance for them to look at kind of real users interacting with some of the technology that they're putting out there. We're not focused only on them. They actually, their smart home kit is it's all got German plugs, which means that it's a nightmare to actually put into English homes. It becomes really cumbersome and it's not nice, which automatically kind of makes it difficult to use in a field trial because people focus on the fact that the sofa no longer fits against the wall because the plug in the way. So we are engaging, they're extremely interested in that kind of stuff, and we're talking to them quite a lot, and they're very interested in how people are interacting with these sorts of things. Beyond that, I'm not sure kind of, that we're not there yet in terms of, we've not looked at how people are actually interacting with this stuff. That's the stuff that really is going on right now. And I'm analysing the previous wave whilst that new lot's being collected. So I've not got much more to say on that yet, but other than that we are in kind of constant dialogue with them and lots of others that we connected to through the kind of marketing materials as well, about the sorts of kind of limitations of perhaps some of their understandings. But yeah, there's not much more to say yet on that.
I wanted to ask about the 20 households actually that you chose. How did you sample them? Are they from the same area? I'm asking actually this because I'm really interested in whether you're going to actually somehow connect this to your previous research on kind of upscale from household to communities once again, and the role of ICTs in creating or recreating the intra and inter-community relationships as well.
Way ahead of me on that one. They're all in Loughborough. They're not in the same area of Loughborough. How did we recruit them? There were two basic, there was kind of a 2x2 matrix, but there was kind of with kids, without kids, and then kind of within that trying to get a range of different housing types, so different built fabric, different heating systems, and so that was one kind of key axis, was kind of socio-demographics and physical properties of the home. And then we got them to rate themselves in terms of their technophilia, basically. To what extent did they see themselves as, I'm a real techno geek, as opposed to those who know this isn't something I'm particularly, and try to get a spread there, because we were very conscious that you market a smart home trial, you get all the early adopters. So we've tried to sample it to make sure that we don't just focus on the guys who, there's one guy in the sample who for years has already been making his own automated cat feeder. You know, it's really, and it has been adapting his burglar alarm to make it exactly, you know, so there's lots of people who are already doing this sort of stuff, and they're interested in this trial to see how they can, what other stuff's available that they can use to really enhance that and go take it to a next level, as it were. And there are others in there who kind of have been quite reluctant in engaging and just think, well, to the extent that this might help me manage my home, manage my heating and so on, this could be a really interesting. And so we've tried to sample across that and not just go, that was one of the problems we had with some of my earlier work on smart meters, was it was mostly early adopters. So that's one aim there, but it does, I mean, there's so many different things you could sample for there, that was a real, again, that was a real debate in the consortium for how we go about that, and that was probably the least worst solution. Then in terms of connecting it with community, we had grand plans at the outset that it was all going to be beautifully connected into kind of community entity initiatives and actually to what extent can we draw these people together and so on, which haven't come to fruition and don't look likely to because of German plugs, actually.
On that note, can I just do one quick question left from Andy
about German plugs? Yeah, I've kind of had to think of a new question really, because colleagues obviously picked up on some of the other ones, but it's partly picking up what Ali was talking about, which is and something that others have talked about as well, which is your objects of analysis and your sort of theory.
Yeah.
And how there are kind of interesting things perhaps going on beyond the scope of those two things. So if we project ourselves into the future, let's say, according to your quote, whether people like it or not, this is going to happen. Let's just say it does happen. How do we actually explain the change? Because for various reasons, you wouldn't really explain it as a change in practice through the performance of people performing practices in a domestic space. For the reasons you said, and kind of Frank and Dale suggested, that actually the practices don't seem to be changing very much.
Yeah.
Technology seems to be adopted into them. So this begins to sound like a bit of a technology adoption story. right, where practices remain stable. And then on the other hand, what you're also talking about from other parts of the project are, there are some very big actors out there who perhaps have big visions about this happening. There are sort of alignments between policy communities, big firms, marketing agencies, and others who have big visions. Now, maybe the explanation of practices in smart homes in the future will not be anything to do with performances in the space, but the dynamics of connections between big, powerful actors like governments and firms. Which isn't directly about your research.
No, but it links nicely to Stefan's talk.
Well, that's right. It's what spills outside of the...
I mean, I'm really pleased that the questions are focused on what I kind of hopefully pre-identified as far away the shakiest part of the analysis, because this is the stuff that I'm trying to kind of get most out. I mean, I don't have an answer for that, really. What is, I mean, you know, it's kind of, how do we explain this? No one seems, you know, whether people like it or not, people don't, there doesn't seem to be any large market demand. There's a large amount of technology push for technologies that people don't seem to necessarily think are actually going to be all that beneficial, perhaps, and that don't seem to fit all that well with what's going on, and that actually people quite, you know, lots of the examples of some of the test houses where people have got kind of artificial smart labs, as it were, set up, are that people don't trust these things. They don't like the fact that big, often utility and technology providers are behind it. You look at concerns now around surveillance and privacy, and that's only going to get worse, you'd think. So it's very hard to understand that. I mean, and actually, if you kind of put all that together, it leads you to thinking, well, maybe this isn't going to happen. But at the same time, we're seeing increasing incorporation of different degrees of smart technology into homes. When you buy a new TV these days, it's almost always kind of a smart TV. It's probably increasingly difficult not to get a smart TV.
Yeah.
Similarly, that's going to be happening, you'd have thought, with sort of smart fridges and so on and so forth. And so it's a gradual process of that happening in terms of the market changing. We're getting the government mandating the rollout of smart meters before they've properly assessed what potential impacts they might have. So there's another rollout, the smartification of everyday life, the digitalisation of kind of homes. It's happening on all fronts all the time. So there's obviously never going to be a singular explanation of how did this happen. There's lots of different explanations, and we can kind of perhaps pick up on some of them. But the question that I think then is the one that I don't have an answer to, and I think would be really interesting to look further, is the kind of connection, I think, between what you're saying and what Stefan's saying, is, well, what are the kind of political effects here? To what extent, who or what and how is this empowering people? You know, to what extent is it doing it? And what, who is it empowering is the kind of one of the very interesting questions here. And I mean, I'm getting increasingly interested in some of Evgeny Morozov's work around kind of algorithmic regulation and these sorts of things, and the extent to which, if you have ambient intelligence and context awareness, you know, i.e. we can detect what you're doing just with your very presence, we can monitor everything you're looking at on your smartphone and computer, we can probably, through a talking plant, even hear the conversations you're having in your home. The extent to which that kind of data can be analysed and used to provide services or restrict certain services from certain people, it is kind of, the potential for that is quite worrying. But that's where the kind of ubiquitous and pervasive computing agenda is going in lots of these things. But that's not coming out from our data yet. That's kind of stuff that's just kind of from broader reading about this kind of these sorts of debates. And it would be fascinating to kind of actually take that further, but we're not really doing it. I don't know if we've got scope to do that in this project specifically. Hopefully that might be something that's kind of coming out of this kind of project, but we're definitely not there yet.
I think that's the perfect place to stop. Just a reminder that we're going to head over to the salutation now for about an hour, but can we thank Tom again for coming and fielding questions.